Well, thank you, Carlos, and indeed it is better that I'm here and alive. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be speaking at the Foundation, and I'm very pleased to once again to visit Lisbon and Portugal. And it's not even raining as it was in London when I left. I'm going to talk today about how science enhances our culture and our civilization, and I shall give a particular emphasis on its importance for innovation. Science can improve our health, our quality of life, help solve the world's biggest problems, support sustainability. It influences nearly everything we do, from heating our homes, turning on the radio, using our phone. I've noticed intelligent phones are very popular in Lisbon. Browsing the internet, the food we eat, the medicines we take. And science is absolutely essential to drive our economies and to helping us tackle global problems such as feeding the world, ensuring we have sufficient energy, keeping an aging population healthy. Science matters to us all. I believe that science can play an even greater role in improving the quality of our lives and of our economies. But to be successful, it has to be both fully engaged with society and multidisciplinary, with different scientific disciplines helping each other, and with scientists working with other professions to put science to good use. It's also crucial that science receives sufficient support. Portugal, like the UK, and much of Europe and the rest of the world, faces economic problems. Support for science is being cut quite significantly here in Portugal, as we've heard. This is a mistake. I shall argue that science is the mainspring for our economies. Without it, we switch off the knowledge and discoveries that lead to the innovations and applications that drive our economies. To cut funding for science during an economic downturn is like burning the seed corn. It will only damage our economic recovery and future sustainable growth. So what is special about science that means we should trust it? What makes it so good at generating reliable knowledge about the natural world? First point I want to make is that good science is based on honesty and on openness. Science is a high calling, and I completely agree with the English 19th century chemist Sir Humphrey Davy, an inventor of the miner's safety lamp, when he said, "To me, there has never been a higher source of honor or distinction than that connected with the advances in science." That is why, in part, I'm still an active researcher. I still run a laboratory. Frankly, it's what keeps me sane. Although I'm not sure my lab colleagues would completely agree on the last point. The bedrock from which all science flows is reproducible data, observation, and experiment. And science is good at generating reliable knowledge because of the way this is done. It means that ultimately what is observed, the data, trumps all, even the most beautiful idea. Scientists need to take account of all observations and experiments, not just cherry-pick data that happens to support their own ideas and their own theories. Scientific issues are settled by the overall strength of evidence. Often, a particular idea drives what observations a scientist makes, but sometimes scientists make observations without a precise idea or hypothesis in mind. More whimsically, I call this following where nature leads you. But experiments and observations alone are not enough. It is the ability to prove that something is not true which is at the center of science. This distinguishes it from beliefs based on religion and ideology, which place much more emphasis on faith, tradition, and opinion. Scientists have to come up with ideas that can be tested. Then experiments have to be devised to test those ideas further. If the result of the experiment or the observations do not support that idea, then it needs to be rejected or modified, and after modification, tested again. If the results of the experiments always support the idea, then it becomes more acceptable as an explanation of that phenomenon. Implicit in this approach is that scientific knowledge evolves. Early on in a scientific study, knowledge is often tentative, and it is only after repeated testing that it becomes increasingly secure. It is this process that makes science reliable, but it does take time. And this can lead to problems when scientists are called upon to give advice on issues when the science is not yet complete. We see this every day in the newspapers, whether a medical procedure is safe, or what foods are good or bad. The public want clear and simple answers, but sometimes that is not possible. People need to understand this, and we need to start in our schools. Science is taught based on the great ideas that have successfully undergone much testing, such as those of Newton, Darwin, and Einstein. So we tend to think all science is equally secure, as if written in stone. But that may not be the case, particularly at an early stage in research when knowledge is more tentative. This view of science should receive greater emphasis at school, because then the public would be better able to appreciate how science impacts on society when it is reliable and when it may not be quite so reliable. It is not always possible to achieve complete certainty on complex scientific problems, yet sometimes we still need to take action. And in these circumstances, society needs to turn to expert scientists for their consensus view. Look at the debate about climate change. The majority of expert climate scientists have reached the consensus view that human activity has resulted in global warming, although there is debate about how much the temperature will rise in the future. There are others, rather few, who take more extreme views, either that warming is not taking place at all, or that it will happen in a very catastrophic way. These extremists have failed to persuade the majority of climate science experts who have judged those scientific arguments made by those to support these more extreme views. They've judged them as being too weak to be convincing. Society should listen to the majority consensus opinion of expert scientists in these situations. There are personal qualities which are important for science, including a skeptical attitude, honesty and transparency, courtesy in scientific dispute, humility and self-doubt help. As the 17th century philosopher of science Francis Bacon said, "If a man will begin with certainties, he shall end in doubts. But if he will be content to begin with doubts, he shall end in certainties." Put all of this together, and you have a process which can offer extraordinary insights into the understanding of the natural world. But the work of science can also require courage, as it sometimes strikes at the heart of accepted thinking. Challenging established opinion is part of science and can bring about revolutionary changes, which can be very unsettling. Displacing the Earth from the center of the universe, first to an orbit around the sun, then to the arm of a galaxy within an infinity of galaxies, has had a profound effect on the position of humankind. Evolution had the same dramatic impact, moving us from being specially created and separate from the rest of life to being related to every living organism on the planet. Charles Darwin recognized this in his Descent of Man. Man with all his qualities, with sympathy, with benevolence, with his godlike intellect, with all these exalted powers, man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. These ideas about the earth and humankind were once unthinkable, once heretical, but are now fully accepted by all those who respect knowledge and the power of reason. Science is a truly revolutionary process, and we have to be ready for all that it might reveal. Improved knowledge of human embryology and the increased ability to keep the unborn child alive have major implications for when life begins and ends, and so for interventions such as abortion. Studies of the brain will reveal correlations between brain activity and what we are thinking, our memories, our emotional states. Increasingly, we are likely to be able to use chemicals to alter brain function, to modify behaviors. Advances such as these will have consequences for our views on free will, justice, and diversity. How much choice do we really have when we make decisions? Is punishment for certain criminal behaviors right if they are strongly influenced by an individual's genes? Will work in neuroscience influence how we educate our children? What will we learn about genetic differences between individuals, genders, and populations? And how might that influence our ideas of equality? These are issues of crucial significance, and I do not know the answers, but they can only be properly addressed if we enjoy a healthy relationship without boundaries between science and society. Scientists need to identify issues early and to encourage open debate about the implications and consequences of scientific and technological advances. Such debates will sometimes be difficult, but they must take place. This is essential if we are to have a society that is comfortable with science and that can reap the benefits that science can bring. And science can bring us great, practical, everyday benefits. It has always been a useful art, generating knowledge that, when properly used, leads to applications through technologies and engineering for the public good. At the birth of modern science, Francis Bacon again argued that scientific knowledge gives us the power to relieve man's estate. Robert Hooke, one of the founders of the Royal Society, emphasized how scientific discoveries on motion, light, gravity, magnetism, and the heavens would improve shipping, watches, optics, and engines for trade and carriage. Today, the world faces major problems. Some uppermost in my mind are food security, climate change, global health, making economies sustainable, all of which need science. It is critical for the proper functioning of our democracies to have mature discussions about these issues. But these debates are sometimes threatened by a misinformed sense of balance and inappropriate headlines in the media, which can give credence to views not supported by the science, and also by those who distort the science with ideology, with politics or religion. From the very beginning, as we've heard, the very beginning of science, there have always been such threats. When Galileo argued that the Earth orbited the sun, the Inquisition did not argue back with science. They simply showed him the instruments of torture. It is very important that we keep such influences separate from scientific debate. The time for politics is after the science and not before the science. Let's look at food security, ensuring that the world is properly fed. This has already been greatly helped in my lifetime by science. The Green Revolution increased agricultural production in the 1960s through high-yielding cereals, better irrigation, and the use of artificial fertilizers and pesticides. Developments led by the scientist Norman Borlaug. The Green Revolution is often credited with saving the lives of over 1 billion people worldwide from starvation. However, at the same time, some environmentalists did not support these initiatives, leading Borlaug to say, Some of the environmental lobbyists of the Western nations are the salt of the earth, but some of them are elitists. They've never experienced the physical sensation of hunger. They do their lobbying from comfortable office suites in Washington or Brussels. If they lived just 1 month amid the misery of the developing world, as I have for 50 years, they'd be crying out for tractors and fertilizer and irrigation canals and be outraged that fashionable elitists back home were trying to deny them these things. He said this in the 1960s. Science, however, is once again being required to improve yields, to make agriculture more sustainable, to extend the range of crops to ecologically more marginal land. This can be helped through improving the growth of crops, through plant breeding, and by the genetic modification of plants, all to generate crops of higher productivity, to reduce pesticide use, to better protect the environment and biodiversity. We need to consider what the science has to say about GMOs, about its risks and benefits, uncoloured by commercial interests and ideological opinion. It is not acceptable if we deny the world's poorest access to ways that could help their food security, if that denial is based on fashion and ill-informed opinion rather than good science. Another great challenge for the world is, of course, climate change. Discussions in this area impinge on politics, commercial interests, and strongly held opinions. And these influences are distorting the scientific debate. Solutions needed to counter global warming are likely to require more concerted world action, regulating the activities of the individual, of industries, and of the nation state. And such restrictions are an anathema to some with particular political and economic viewpoints. Equally, those of an opposite viewpoint may exaggerate the extent of future global warming because of their affinities towards greater regulation and world government. This leads to some polemicists to confuse the debate by mixing up the science with politics. The answer here, as always, is to focus on transparency and good science. There is no room for preconceived ideas. Again, first we need the science, then the politics. Now I want to turn to an issue which preoccupies many of us today, our economies. The Industrial Revolution brought scientists, engineers, technologists, and entrepreneurs together to apply science to industry and the economy. The result then was the steam engine, providing power, chemistry and geology, improving ceramics and the use of natural resources, mechanics and engineering, constructing machines for transport and for manufacture. It's an era that was symbolized by the Lunar Society, a group of British intellectuals, including James Watt, Erasmus Darwin, Matthew Boulton, and Josiah Wedgwood, who discuss science and how science leads to new technologies and inventions that can support the economy. They met together in the Midlands, in the middle of England, once a month under the full moon. Some called them the lunatics as a consequence of that. The full moon could illuminate them during their ride home after dinner. I suspect after too much wine as well. Now, where would our economy be without electricity and electromagnetism, electronics, synthetic chemistry, atomic physics, biochemistry, and molecular biology? Some say Michael Faraday, speaking a little later, answered the Prime Minister of his day when he was asked what good was his invention of the electric transformer, generator and motor might be. He replied by saying, "Why, Prime Minister, someday you can tax it." Now, although this was almost never, certainly was unlikely to be said by Faraday, this anecdote captures the view of some politicians and business leaders who fail to grasp how science enhances industrial capabilities and creates wealth. So how can we make sure that science thrives and continues to bring benefits to our economy? Well, I strongly argue that the first requirement is to have a high-quality science base. So how can that be achieved? Good science has a tradition of respect for empiricism. By the way, not all science is good science. I think we just have to be completely clear about that. Good science has a tradition of respect for empiricism, emphasizing reliable observation and experiment, as I've already said. Most importantly, science has to be carried out in a culture of openness and freedom. The scientific endeavor is at its most successful when there is freedom of thought. Scientists need to be able to freely express doubts, to be skeptical about established orthodoxy, and must not be too strongly directed from the top, which stifles creativity. During the Cold War, Russia was able to build a nuclear bomb and to send the first man into space. Two great achievements, but they were based on previously known and understood physics. But work requiring new science, such as genetics and crop improvement, for example, were completely damaged because for ideological reasons, Stalin backed Lysenko, who rejected Mendelian genetics, accepted elsewhere in the world. Similarly, in Nazi Germany, Hitler rejected the work of Einstein because it was Jewish physics. Science cannot thrive in such societies. For science to flourish, a broad portfolio of research investment is also required. There's a continuum of research ranging from discovery research through research aimed at translating knowledge for application onto subsequent innovation leading to the development of new technologies, new applications. Sometimes there's a temptation to invest too heavily in a particular part of this spectrum, and that should be resisted. Sometimes it is argued that we should concentrate only on translation and innovation and not discovery. But that is a mistake. As Sir George Porter, Nobel laureate, a previous president of the Royal Society, said, to feed applied science by starving basic science is like economizing on the foundations of a building so it may be built higher. It is only a matter of time before the whole edifice crumbles. Research often needs a longer time scale than is usual with the more short-term priorities and policies of private business or politicians elected on short-term cycles. This causes problems with longer-term projects, and most science is longer-term, such as translating scientific advances into useful applications. Bridging the often short-term pressures from commerce and politicians with the longer times required to develop discovery research into effective applications is crucial. But bridging it is difficult. Greater collaboration between publicly funded research and private companies, in my view, can help bringing science to application. Now, given the importance of science in our lives, how can we make the best decisions about what research should be supported? What are the factors that have to be considered when making these decisions? The one that I think is crucial is the scientist who is carrying out the research. Major discoveries in science are usually associated with highly talented individuals who combine a number of qualities. They should have in-depth knowledge, be creative, understand the values of science and how research is done, be well motivated, be effective in achieving what they set out to do. In-depth knowledge of an area is essential, but needs to be combined with peripheral vision and understanding and openness to what other sciences can contribute. Good scientists also have to be very lucky. But carrying out good scientific research is a creative activity, and scientists have more similarities than might be imagined with those who pursue other creative activities, such as the arts, writing, and the media. Like other creative workers, scientists thrive on freedom, as I've already argued, and organizing them is like herding cats. Freedom of thought, to pursue a line of investigation wherever it may lead, to uncover uncomfortable truths, are all crucial to an effective scientific endeavor. a scientist whose thoughts are restrained, who is too strongly directed from above, or who is unable to freely exchange ideas will not be an effective scientist. Scientists need to have respect for reliable and reproducible data, a skeptical approach which challenges orthodoxy and the scientist's own ideas, an abhorrence of the falsification or cherry-picking of data, a commitment to the pursuit of truth. Research scientists also need to be very highly motivated. Often this motivation is provided by a passionate curiosity about the natural world, a desire to know how things work or how they can be directed to achieve particular outcomes. But other motivations are also important. A desire to undertake public good through the eradication of disease, for example, to make something useful, to create economic wealth, or simply to become famous. But whatever the motivation, it has to be strong, because the pursuit of research is long and it is difficult. Given this emphasis on the primacy of the individuals carrying out the research, decisions about who to fund should therefore be guided by the effectiveness of the researchers making a research proposal. The most useful criterion for effectiveness is immediate past progress. Those that have recently carried out high-quality research are most likely to continue to do so. In coming to research funding decisions, the objective is not to support those that write good quality proposals, but those who will carry out good quality research. So attention should be given to performance and not simply planned activity. Now, obviously, such an emphasis needs to be tempered for those who have only a limited recent past record, such as early career researchers or those with a break in their careers. In these cases, face-to-face interviews can be extremely helpful in determining the quality of the researcher making the application. It gets rid of the bullshit, in summary. So making good decisions about research funding requires a focus on the quality, passion, and past performance of the scientists proposing the research. Now, a perennially vexing question is how prescriptive should research funding agencies be in determining what research areas should be supported? This recurring issue arises because of the tensions between scientists wanting the freedom to decide what projects they should pursue and society which supports science not simply as a cultural activity increasing knowledge, but also as an activity aimed at improving the lot of humankind through achieving specific useful objectives. So this is an important issue, a paradox. Now, one frequent response of funding agencies and sometimes their political masters when faced with this issue is to carry out a strategic review, to decide priorities, to identify research areas judged either as being especially timely for future advances or reflecting particular needs for society. This can lead to initiatives that shape or sponsor research, sometimes with ring-fenced allocations of research funding. This is a very rational sort of approach. Although rational, although well-attentioned to address a particular problem, it does run risks, and the major risk is funding low-quality research. A major problem is that the decisions are being separated from the consideration of particular projects and the scientists that will carry out that project. As a consequence, such initiatives can attract less creative and effective scientists who simply follow where resources are being made available. A second problem is that the identification of favoured and non-favoured research areas is usually made by committees made up of senior researchers, usually with white hair and male, who are not particularly research active anymore themselves. Such committees are prone to coming up with the very obvious and being behind the cutting edge. So how can this difficult tension be resolved? And it is difficult. I don't want to, I mean, this is something I struggle with. It is an important problem. There aren't easy answers here. Now, in my opinion, there are three issues that are relevant. The first is what we call in Britain is the Haldane principle. I'll explain that in a moment. The second is a different approach when considering programs aimed at achieving applications and specific goals. And the third is a more imaginative role for scientific leadership in influencing funding. And I'm going to consider briefly each of those points. The Haldane principle is usually interpreted as meaning that researchers and not politicians should decide which specific research project should be supported. Politicians, informed by external advice, should decide on the overall science budget and with identifying key priorities such as specific challenges or key infrastructures. However, the politician should not be involved in decisions on specific funding proposals, which should be made by researchers using peer review. I'm sort of caricaturing this process. Now, I suggest we learn from this and extend this view by arguing more generally that decisions as often as possible should be made closely to the researchers actually carrying out the research. Those leading research funding bodies should focus their attention on high-level priorities, avoiding the temptation to become too prescriptive and finely grained in recommendations concerning areas that should be funded. The point I'm making here can be illustrated by a metaphor derived from geographical exploration. The metaphor I'm going to use is based on the Royal Geographical Society based in London. But if I'd thought about it, I should have taken a Portuguese one based on its wonderful tradition of exploration and navigation. Now, the Royal Geographical Society based in London in the 19th century might decide it wants to support an expedition. And it could decide to sponsor perhaps exploration of the Amazon, the source of the Nile, or the Antarctic. But it would be ill-advised to be too finely grained in its deliberations to specify which Amazon tributary or African lake or South Polar glacier that should be the focus of attention. That, of course, should be left to the explorer on the ground and not those in the committee in London. The funder's role should be to define the general geographical region of interest, identify the best explorer, and then properly equip that explorer so they can be most effective in the field. Research funders should behave in the same way. They should put their trust most in the explorer scientist carrying out the research rather than in the committee in London or perhaps in Lisbon. However, this approach, which I think can cover quite a lot of science, does need modification when a research program is directed at achieving specific goals or applications. In other words, work that is close to applications for a particular objective. And this requires more prescriptive behaviour. The point I think I'm trying to make is you can't treat all science the same way. And that is what sometimes those in power naively do. Goal-directed research, which I'm referring to, actually can occur anywhere in the scientific spectrum. Whole genome sequencing would be an example at the discovery end, for example. That's clearly very goal-directed. And that's important to be supported. But it tends to be more prevalent, goal-directed research, when thinking about applications, translation, and innovation. It is necessary and valuable to identify sectors which are close to application as areas that are worth supporting. However, identification of these sectors should involve both those carrying out the research and those who want to use the outcomes of that research. There needs to be a greater contact between those two communities. This more prescriptive approach applies to research close to application, both for profit activities, commercial ones driving the economy, but also for not-for-profit activities such as improving health and protecting the environment, all of which have applied goals. Now, a third issue concerns the role of scientific leadership. If, after getting good advice, a research funding leader decides that a particular research area is important and should receive support, the usual response is to ring-fence resources. I think it would be more useful for that research leader to undertake a process of education and inspiration of researchers so they become motivated to think about working in that area. This is more difficult, but the ring-fencing approach is lazy. I'm suggesting motivation and inspiration. Now, should the area really be as promising as the research leader thinks, then it should be relatively easy to persuade high-quality scientists that there is interesting work to be done. And as a consequence, they will submit proposals to the normal response mode system. Should it not be so interesting as that research leader thinks, then perhaps high-quality researchers will not be impressed and perhaps will not be persuaded to submit proposals. I suggest in this case the research leader should perhaps think again as to whether his or her enthusiasm is well placed. I have never met a research leader who behaves like this. Research leaders do need to be proactive, but not by ring fencing, not by micromanagement of the research agenda, but by educating and inspiring the research community. We need leadership, we need education, we need inspiration. We don't just need management. Very important. Are there any other special features concerning decision making with respect to science close to application? Science across the whole continuum shares many similarities and indeed supports other scientific activities in other places within that continuum. And this includes the importance of supporting talented individuals to get the job done. However, work closer to application is more likely to be multidisciplinary, may well require greater teamwork, not only covering more scientific disciplines, but also activities outside science, including finance, market analysis, and the law. It requires a great deal of effort to get individuals from such diverse backgrounds to work well together. Attention needs to be paid to encouraging mutual respect between these different sectors and to breaking down the boundaries that often separate these different sectors. This would be encouraged if there was much greater permeability between sectors, encouraging the transfer of both ideas and people more freely. We need to reduce these boundaries. We have in place too many barriers, too many silos that inhibit free transfer and even encourage suspicion between the very people that need to be working closely together. One of the problems is that increasing knowledge has led to specialization, making interactions between different scientists, industry, the public services, and other professions more difficult. This is a key message, I think. The promotion of translation and innovation requires lowering the boundaries and good permeability across the sectors. Much is spoken about the valley of death, the gap between the generation of new knowledge and the application of that new knowledge, particularly for commercialization. Usually, the focus of discussion is on providing research support to bridge that gap, but attention also needs to be paid to pushing the bridgeheads further out into that valley of death. There can be a problem when attempts to translate are made too prematurely before knowledge is sufficiently reliable and complete. This is especially the case in the biosciences, given the complexity of living organisms. To make a cinematic pun, to rush into translation runs the risk of becoming lost in translation. A firmer bridgehead needs to be built, involving a more extended and secure knowledge base in the area of interest before attempting to pass over the valley of death. Similarly, a bridgehead is required on the other side that needs also to be extended out, with more investment from industry in research aimed at capturing new knowledge from the other side of the valley. Without research capacity and knowledge in industry, it will be difficult to build back over the valley of death. We have to remember that when we see research budgets cut across the board in industry to achieve short-term profits. It will lead to long-term problems. I'm coming to nearly the end, if you're beginning to tire of English. I want to put some of these ideas into practice at the new Francis Crick Institute being built in London next to the Eurostar terminal at St Pancras Station. It opens next year. It will house 1,400 scientists in one of the biggest, perhaps even the biggest, biomedical laboratories buildings in the world. It will not just be a place for scientific experiments, but also a place for experimenting in the way science is done and the way science can lead to translation and innovation. As director of that institute, I want to create a cultural and economic hothouse of scientific ideas and applications to make exciting discoveries relevant to improvements in our health and to drive our economy. I don't want scientists to stay in their labs all the time. I want them to mix with the best minds from industry, the city, the public services, the media, to spark off new ideas to help science benefit us all. It will be a place without departments or restricting hierarchies, with scientists free to pursue their own creative ideas in a highly interactive and open building. It will be science without boundaries. If it sounds a bit like anarchy, that is because it is a bit like anarchy. It is often in mixed up and chaotic circumstances that the most creative work is done. Remember Harry Lime in the film The Third Man, who said, "In Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed. But they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love, they had 500 years of democracy and peace, and what did they produce? The cuckoo clock." It's really unfair on the Swiss, that, by the way. If we want science to deliver all of this, we must have the vision to succeed. If we get it right, our whole society will benefit. It is time for a new deal between science and society, a new enlightenment to achieve all of these things, to encourage, cherish, and promote our science for the benefit of humankind. Thank you very much. Thank you.